Welcome back to Smart Talks. Today, we're doing a deep dive into Rolf Dobelli's The Art of Thinking Clearly. Um, it's a fascinating exploration of cognitive biases.
Right.
Those mental shortcuts that can trip us up, even when we think we're being totally rational.
Yeah, these biases are often invisible to us,
Right.
operating beneath the surface and influencing our decisions in ways we don't even realize.
It's like having these hidden gremlins messing with our thinking.
Yeah.
But Dobelli gives us this incredible toolkit to identify and understand them.
Yeah.
To help us unpack all this, we'll be exploring some key insights from the book in a Q&A format. Ready to dive in?
Let's go.
All right, first up, survivorship bias.
Yeah.
What is it, and how does it affect how we see success?
Survivorship bias is our tendency to focus on the winners, the survivors,
Right.
while overlooking all the failures along the way. Think of aspiring authors.
Yeah.
We celebrate the few who make it big,
Right.
but forget about the countless others who never get published.
Oh, yeah.
Or professional swimmers, we marvel at their physiques. Right.
Assuming it's all due to training. But they likely had those physical advantages to begin with, which is what allowed them to excel in the first place.
It's like we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
Completely missing the massive chunk beneath the surface.
Exactly. And this bias can lead us to make some pretty skewed judgments. We might overestimate our own chances of success in a particular field because we're only seeing the success stories, not the failures.
So how do we avoid falling into this trap? Do we just need to become cynical and assume everyone's exaggerating their successes?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
The key is to actively seek out the graveyards,
Okay.
to learn from the failures as much as we celebrate the successes.
Mm-hmm.
If you're interested in a particular industry, research the companies that didn't make it, understand why they failed. That knowledge can be just as valuable as studying the successes.
That's such a good point. It's like that saying, learn from the mistakes of others. You can't live long enough to make them all yourself. Precisely. Think about your own goals and the paths you're considering. What are the potential pitfalls that might not be immediately obvious? Where can you find the unseen failures to learn from?
This is making me think about all the times I've compared myself to those seemingly perfect Instagram influencers, completely forgetting that they're only showing the carefully curated highlights of their lives.
It's a curated reality, and it's so easy to fall into that trap of comparison, especially in today's social media landscape.
Okay, on to the next bias. Let's talk about the illusion of control.
Okay.
What is it, and how does it trick us into thinking we have more power over events than we actually do?
The illusion of control is our tendency to overestimate our ability to influence outcomes.
Okay.
Especially in situations where chance plays a significant role. Dobelli uses a great example in the book. Imagine a man standing in a public square waving his hat wildly. When asked what he's doing, he says he's keeping the giraffes away. When pointed out that there are no giraffes around, he proudly declares that he must be doing a good job then.
That's hilarious. It's like taking credit for the sun rising every morning.
Exactly. And while that example is humorous, we see this playing out in more serious ways too. Think about lottery tickets. People often feel more in control if they get to choose their own numbers.
Oh, yeah.
Even though the odds are exactly the same, whether the numbers are randomly assigned or personally selected.
Oh, I've totally seen that. People get really attached to their numbers.
This illusion can have real-world consequences. Take the stock market, for example.
Okay.
Investors often react dramatically to changes in the federal funds rate, even though its impact on the real economy is often minimal.
So it's like we're pressing a button and feeling like we're in control, even if the button doesn't actually do anything.
It's a bit like that, yes. We crave that sense of agency, even when it's not really there.
This is making me think about all the times I've stressed over things that were ultimately out of my control.
Where do you see this illusion of control showing up in your own life? Are there situations where you might be overestimating your influence?
That's a good question. I'm starting to see this everywhere now, especially in my work. I tend to micromanage and want to control every detail, even though sometimes it's better to delegate and trust the process.
That's a great insight. It's about recognizing when that need for control is helpful and when it's actually hindering you.
All right, moving on to decision-making. What was one of the most surprising things you learned about this from the book?
One of the biggest aha moments for me was the paradox of choice.
Okay.
The idea that more options don't necessarily lead to better decisions.
Wait, so having too many choices can actually be a bad thing?
That's right. Dobelli cites a fascinating experiment where a supermarket set up a display with either 6 or 24 varieties of jam.
Wow. Okay.
Customers could sample and buy at a discount. Interestingly, people were far more likely to buy jam when there were only 6 choices available.
That's so counterintuitive. Why would that be?
It turns out that too many choices can lead to analysis paralysis.
Yeah.
We get overwhelmed, can't decide, and ultimately end up choosing nothing at all. Or even if we do make a choice, we're often less satisfied with it.
This is making me think about all those times I stood in the grocery store, staring at the endless options, completely frozen by indecision.
It's a common experience.
Right.
And it doesn't just happen with groceries. Think about online shopping, dating apps, even choosing a career path.
Oh, yeah.
The paradox of choice can make even simple decisions feel monumental.
So what's the solution? Do we just need to limit our options?
That's one approach, but it's also about being mindful of our decision-making process. Recognize when you're feeling overwhelmed by choices. Try to narrow down your options to a manageable number.
Okay.
And remember, sometimes good enough is better than endlessly searching for perfect.
That's such a helpful reminder. I'm definitely guilty of striving for perfection, which often leads to procrastination and indecision.
It's a common trap,
Yeah.
but by recognizing these patterns, we can start to make more conscious choices.
Okay, next up. How do our emotions influence our judgments? Especially when it comes to assessing risks and benefits.
Dobelli introduces the affect heuristic,
Okay.
which explains how our likes and dislikes strongly influence our perceptions of risk and reward.
Oh.
In other words, our feelings can sometimes overpower logic when making decisions.
So if we really love something, we might downplay the risks and amplify the benefits, even if the evidence suggests otherwise.
Exactly. Dobelli uses the example of someone who loves motorcycles. They might minimize the dangers of riding while focusing on the thrill and excitement.
I can see that. It's like how our feelings about certain politicians can color our view of their policies, regardless of the actual facts.
Precisely. Our emotions create a powerful filter through which we perceive the world.
This makes me think about all the times I've made impulsive purchases because I was excited about something, completely ignoring the practical considerations. Like that time I bought those concert tickets, even though I knew I couldn't really afford them.
We've all been there. The affect heuristic can be a powerful force, especially when it comes to things we're passionate about.
Okay, last question for this part of our deep dive. After reading this book, how can we become better thinkers, more aware of these biases, and ultimately make smarter choices?
The first step, as we've been discussing, is awareness. Familiarize yourself with these common thinking errors. Learn their names. Understand how they operate.
Okay.
And start noticing them in your own thinking and the thinking of others.
So it's like having a mental checklist of red flags to watch out for.
Exactly. The next step is to pause and reflect before making important decisions. Don't just jump in headfirst, guided by your initial gut feeling.
Right.
Take the time to consider different perspectives, gather more information, and challenge your own assumptions.
And maybe even try to think about how those assumptions might be influenced by these sneaky little cognitive biases.
Absolutely. And finally, seek out diverse perspectives. Talk to people who disagree with you. Expose yourself to different viewpoints. This can help you break out of your own echo chamber and see the world more clearly.
It's like getting a mental workout, flexing those critical thinking muscles.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, becoming a better thinker is a lifelong journey. There's always more to learn and discover.
I love that. This is just the beginning of our exploration. We'll be back with part 2 of our deep dive into the art of thinking clearly very soon.
Looking forward to it. Ready to continue our exploration of cognitive biases.
Absolutely. Let's dive back into the art of thinking clearly. There's so much to uncover.
There is. And remember, we're all susceptible to these biases. It's not about being perfect. It's about awareness and making more conscious choices.
Well said. Okay, in part 1, we talked about survivorship bias, the illusion of control, and the paradox of choice.
Right?
What other fascinating biases does Dobelli highlight?
Let's talk about confirmation bias. This is our tendency to seek out and interpret information in a way that confirms our existing beliefs, while ignoring or downplaying evidence that contradicts them.
So it's like we're wearing these mental blinders that only allow us to see what we already believe to be true.
That's a great analogy. Dobelli explains that we're all guilty of this to some extent.
Yeah.
We gravitate towards people and information sources that reinforce our worldview, and we're more likely to dismiss or discredit information that challenges our existing beliefs.
It's like that saying, people see what they want to see and hear what they want to hear.
Exactly. And this bias can have a profound impact on our decision making. It can lead us to make poor investments, stay in unhealthy relationships, or even hold on to harmful prejudices.
So how do we overcome confirmation bias? Is it even possible?
It's not easy, but it's definitely possible. The key is to actively seek out dissenting viewpoints. Challenge your own beliefs and be open to the possibility that you might be wrong.
That's a tall order, especially in today's world, where we're constantly bombarded with information that reinforces our existing biases.
It is challenging, but it's crucial if we want to make sound judgments and avoid falling prey to misinformation.
I think social media algorithms definitely play a role in this. They feed us more of what we already agree with, which can create these echo chambers where our beliefs are constantly reinforced.
Absolutely. It's important to be aware of these filter bubbles and to actively seek out information from a variety of sources.
Okay, let's talk about another bias. What is availability bias? And how does it affect our perception of risk?
Availability bias is our tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled or come to mind readily. In other words, the more vivid or emotionally charged a memory is, the more likely we are to believe that such an event is common or likely to happen again.
So it's like if we see a news report about a plane crash, we're suddenly more afraid of flying, even though statistically, flight is still one of the safest modes of transportation.
Exactly. The media plays a big role in shaping our perceptions of risk through availability bias. They tend to focus on sensational stories, which can make certain events seem more common than they actually are.
This makes me think about all the fear-mongering that goes on in the news. It's like they're preying on our availability bias to get us to tune in.
That's a good point. And it's not just the news. We can also fall prey to this bias in our personal lives. If we've recently experienced a negative trend, such as a car accident or a burglary, we might start to believe that such events are more common than they really are.
So we're essentially letting our memories dictate our perception of reality.
That's right. And this can lead to irrational fears and anxieties.
So how do we combat availability bias? Do we just have to ignore the news and avoid thinking about negative events?
That's not realistic or even advisable. It's important to stay informed and to learn from our experiences, but we also need to be aware of how availability bias can skew our perceptions. When we hear about a negative event, we should try to put it into context. Ask ourselves how often such events actually occur, and look for statistical data rather than relying solely on anecdotal evidence.
That's great advice. Like taking a step back and saying, okay, let's look at the bigger picture here.
Exactly. Don't let your emotions or the latest news headline dictate your perception of reality.
Okay, one last bias for this section. Tell me about the anchoring effect.
The anchoring effect describes our tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive, even if that information is irrelevant or arbitrary. It's like our minds latch on to that initial anchor and then adjust our subsequent judgments based on that starting point.
So it's like if someone asks us to guess the population of a city, and the first number they mention is 10 million.
Right.
We're likely to guess a number closer to 10 million, even if we have no idea what the actual population is.
That's a great example. That initial anchor, even if it's completely random, can have a powerful influence on our thinking.
It's like our brains are saying, well, that must be a good starting point, so let's just adjust from there.
Exactly. And this bias can affect our decisions in all sorts of ways. For example, when negotiating a salary.
Yeah.
The first number mentioned often sets the tone for the entire negotiation.
So if you're the one making the first offer, you have a significant advantage.
That's right. The anchoring effect can also play a role in how we perceive the value of products and services. If we see a high price tag on an item, we might be more likely to believe that it's a high-quality product, even if there's no evidence to support that belief.
So it's all about setting the frame.
Exactly. And this bias can be especially powerful when we're dealing with unfamiliar or complex situations.
So how do we avoid falling prey to the anchoring effect?
The key is to be aware of its existence and to actively challenge the first piece of information you receive. Don't just blindly accept it as truth. Ask questions. Do your own research. And consider alternative perspectives.
It's like saying, okay, that's one data point, but let's not jump to conclusions just yet.
Exactly. Gather more information, weigh the evidence, and then make an informed decision.
This is making me think about all the times I've been swayed by a salesperson's initial pitch without really considering other options.
It happens to the best of us. But by recognizing these biases, we can start to become more savvy consumers and negotiators.
Okay, let's move on to our next set of biases. This time, we'll focus on how our past experiences and our tendency to seek patterns can lead to faulty thinking.
Sounds good. Let's start with the story bias.
What is that, and how does it distort our understanding of the world?
The story bias describes our innate desire to create narratives, to make sense of the world by weaving together events into a coherent story.
We're back with part 3 of our deep dive into the art of thinking clearly.
Ready to explore some more fascinating cognitive biases.
Definitely. In the last part, we were just starting to discuss the story bias.
Right. The story bias describes our innate desire to create narratives to make sense of the world by weaving together events into a coherent story.
So it's like we're all natural-born storytellers.
Yeah. Exactly. And while storytelling is a powerful tool for communication and understanding, it can also lead us astray when we start to impose narratives onto events that might not have a clear cause and effect relationship.
So it's like we're connecting the dots even when the dots might not actually be connected.
Precisely, Dobelli uses the example of two simple sentences. The king died and then the queen died, versus the king died and then the queen died of grief. The second sentence, even though it adds no factual information, is more memorable and emotionally resonant because it creates a story, a link between the two events.
It's like our brains crave those connections even if they're not really there.
Right, and this bias can affect our judgment in all sorts of ways. For example, when we hear about a successful entrepreneur, we might be tempted to create a narrative about their hard work and determination, ignoring the role of luck or other external factors.
It looks like we're simplifying complex events to fit into our pre-existing understanding of how the world works.
Exactly, and this can lead us to make faulty assumptions and generalizations.
So how do we combat the story bias? Do we just have to give up on storytelling altogether?
Not at all. Storytelling is a powerful tool, but we need to use it wisely. When we hear a story, we should ask ourselves, is this just a narrative? Or are there facts to support it? Are there alternative explanations that might be equally valid? And what are the potential biases of the storyteller?
It's like saying, okay, that's a good story, but let's not take it at face value.
Exactly. Scrutinize the narrative, look for evidence, and be open to alternative interpretations.
This makes me think about how we often create stories around our own lives, shaping our memories to fit a certain narrative.
Absolutely. We all have our own personal narratives that we tell ourselves and others, and it's important to be aware of how those narratives might be shaped by our biases.
Okay, let's talk about another bias related to our tendency to seek patterns. What is the gambler's fallacy, and how does it affect our decision-making, especially when it comes to games of chance?
The gambler's fallacy is the mistaken belief that past events can influence future outcomes, especially in situations where the outcomes are random and independent of one another.
So it's like thinking that if a coin has landed on heads 5 times in a row, it's more likely to land on tails the next time.
Exactly. The reality is that each coin flip is a separate event, and the odds are always 50-50, regardless of what happened in previous flips.
But it feels like there must be some sort of balancing force at work, right?
That's the illusion. Our brains are wired to look for patterns even when they don't exist, and we often see patterns where there's only randomness.
This makes me think about all those times I played roulette and felt like, okay, black has come up 3 times in a row, so red must be due.
It's a common mistake, and casinos capitalize on this fallacy all the time.
So how do we avoid falling prey to the gambler's fallacy? Do we just have to accept that we have no control over random events?
That's part of it, but it's also about understanding the nature of probability and recognizing that past events don't influence future outcomes in random systems.
So it's like saying, okay, every spin of the roulette wheel is a fresh start.
Exactly. Don't let your past experiences or your desire to see patterns cloud your judgment.
I think this bias can also show up in our everyday lives, not just in gambling. Like if we've had a string of bad luck, we might start to think that things are bound to turn around soon.
That's a great point. It's about recognizing when we're applying this fallacy to situations where it doesn't actually apply.
Okay, let's wrap up our discussion of cognitive biases with one more. Tell me about the hindsight bias.
The hindsight bias is our tendency to see past events as more predictable than they actually were. It's like looking back and saying, oh, I knew that was going to happen all along, even though at the time the event might have seemed completely unexpected.
So it's like we're rewriting history to make ourselves look smarter or more prescient.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Our brains love to create narratives to make sense of the past by connecting the dots, and once an event has occurred, it's easy to look back and see a clear path leading up to it.
It's like we're creating a mental highlight reel of all the moments that led to that particular outcome.
Exactly. And this bias can prevent us from learning from our mistakes. If we believe that we knew it all along, we're less likely to examine our decision-making process and identify areas where we could have done better.
So it's like we're robbing ourselves of valuable feedback.
That's right. The hindsight bias can also make us overconfident in our ability to predict future events. If we believe that we were able to accurately predict the past, we might start to think that we can do the same for the future.
So how do we overcome the hindsight bias?
One approach is to actively challenge our own recollections. When we think back on an event, we should try to recall how we felt and what we knew at the time, rather than letting our current knowledge color our perceptions.
So it's like trying to put ourselves back in that moment with all its uncertainty and unknowns.
Exactly. We should also be open to the possibility that our memories might be faulty, and we should avoid making sweeping generalizations based on a single event.
That's great advice. It's like saying, okay, I might have been right this time, but let's not assume that I'll always be right.
Exactly. Humility is key when it comes to combating the hindsight bias.
Wow, we've covered so much ground today. This deep dive into the art of thinking clearly has been incredibly eye-opening.
It's a fascinating subject, and I hope our listeners have found it valuable.
I'm sure they have.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, let's reiterate some key takeaways. We've learned that we're all susceptible to cognitive biases, these mental shortcuts that can lead us to make irrational decisions. But by becoming aware of these biases, questioning our assumptions, and seeking out diverse perspectives, we can start to mitigate their impact and make more informed choices.
It's about becoming more conscious and deliberate in our thinking.
Exactly, and it's an ongoing process. There's always more to learn and discover about ourselves and how our minds work.
Absolutely.
If you're intrigued by what we've discussed today, I highly recommend checking out Rolf Dobelli's book, The Art of Thinking Clearly. It's a thought-provoking and engaging read that will challenge your assumptions and help you become a more critical thinker.
It's a great resource for anyone who wants to improve their decision-making skills.
And be sure to like and share this episode with anyone who might find it helpful. The more we can spread awareness about these cognitive biases, the better equipped we'll all be to make smarter choices.
I agree.
And as always, happy learning.